and take a moment to check in. So there is obviously this constant re-examining of ourselves every time we lie on the floor. And the constant is the floor. The floor is relatively unchanging. So it gives you somewhat reliable and consistent feedback. So in the short lifetime that we're lying on this floor, we would like to think that it won't change. However, I remember teaching a series of workshops in Christchurch after their second bout of earthquakes, and I had to be really careful about, the floor is not impermanent, and it's not reliable. And I don't know anybody. You're from the New Zealand people. You're not from Christchurch, no. And so, how fundamentally destabilizing it is to not even be able to rely on the floor as a support. And in our situation, Feldenkrais is an accurate point of feedback. So, be grateful for this, the constancy of the floor here in Box Hill, and use it to your advantage. So if your memory is a bit dodgy, the floor is the constant. You can refer back to it. And we'll talk a fair bit about about memory, because memory and learning are so intimately connected. They are in fact, the same kind of, they're underpinned by the same physiological processes. So what do you remember about the conversation that you had with the floor? So you've had a couple with Zoran with the eye ATM, and this morning during the sucking ATM. And of course, you're getting constant feedback from the floor through your feet, whether you're paying attention to it or not. You can reflect on the snapshots of information that you get from the floor, and what's it telling you now about your state of being. So that's a pretty indistinct question. Are you able to completely give up your weight to the floor? Yes or no? That's another dumb question. What parts of you really allow the floor to hold them, and what parts are kind of holding themselves off the floor, so that there is this kind of palpable gap between a body part? So you could think about the sort of positive space aspect of the bits of you that are touching the floor where there is contact, and the negative space. So for most people, there is this negative or empty space when you're lying flat behind the small of your back. Not for everybody, but for most people. For most people, there's a little space behind your knees. I'd say for everybody, there is a space behind the back of your neck. You may have filled it with a towel, but it's certainly not touching, the back of your neck is not touching the floor itself. And go through your body and find out any other areas that arc away from the floor. It might be the back of your ankles, depending on how your arms are lying. So everybody's got their arms in a different position, but it might be somewhere around the wrist. It might be behind the back of the shoulders. So that would be the sort of typical areas that are away from the floor to more or less an extent. And then you could get more refined in your examination of this. And is it the same on both sides? So is that an area of negative space? Let's say you have it behind your knees. Does it feel the same? So how do you sense a negative space? That in itself is a bit of that could send your brain into a bit of an existential crisis. How do you sense nothing? Well, you sense where there's something and where there's something stops, don't you? You sense where the calf touching finishes and then the thigh starts to touch, and that bit in between is the gap, is the back of the knee. That would be one way of sensing nothing, sensing emptiness. And is that kind of the same as behind the right knee versus the left knee? And then if we move up to the other, well, the most common space, which is behind the lumbar spine. So the lumbar spine is the lower spine, the spine that's in the small of your back. The bit between the pelvis and the ribs. It's a bit that curves in for almost everybody. What's the dimensionality of that space? And again, you sense the boundaries of the space by where it begins. So where can you sense the back of your pelvis still making contact, and then it no longer does? So that part of your spine is arching away from the floor. And then there's a point where the spine arches back in the direction of the floor. So how do you sense the length of that? The length from the beginning to the end, or the bottom to the top? The width of it, even. How high would it be? Can you have a sense of how high that might be off the floor? And this is a different sense that we're using, isn't it? So if we've been talking about the tactile sense of the lips and the visual sense of the eyes, and in passing, the other sort of teleceptors of the head, well, none of those are of any use to you in answering this question about how high the small of your back is arching at its peak from the floor. So just how grainy is that image? How imprecise or precise? And of course, we could yoke in another sense, and you could slide your hand underneath that part of you and use your tactile proprioceptive senses to feel. Go ahead. You know you want to. Now, for some people, the arch is quite flat and they actually have to arch more to make space for their hand to go under or roll slightly. And that's fine. That tells you something. But try and be as uninterrupted as possible. Otherwise, the act of observing changes the behavior, which, of course, in science is always the case. And then take your hand out again and go back to sensing from that deeply internal space. And what does it have? Has that added information, the use of the touch of your hand? Has it clarified, or has it completely blown your original impression out the water? Okay. And now bend your knees up so that your feet are standing. And interlace your fingers, so your fingers are interlaced one by one, and pop them behind your head. Find a place where your feet can feel grounded, and that the floor, that you take time, that your feet have that relationship to the floor where the floor can support them. We'll talk a lot more about this over the years, weeks, hours, whatever, however long you're here for. And take a moment now to notice that simply bending your knees and having your feet standing changes the spaces between you and the floor. So obviously the space between the back of your knees and the floor has increased rather dramatically. And maybe the space behind the small of your back has changed somewhat as well. Maybe it hasn't. Can you tell if it has or if it hasn't? And if you're really not sure, you could, you persist with that purely internal sensing first until you can stand it no longer, and then feel free to just use your hand for a moment to slide under to see what is the nature of the change, if any. Okay, and return your hands interlaced back behind your head. And having your arms up obviously will change the space behind your back as well. But we'll leave that for now. Very gently, slowly, begin the motion where your elbows come slightly towards each other, not even slightly, quite definitely. And you begin to use your arms to lift your head a little bit off the floor. So this is not a stomach cruncher. This is a very gentle exploration. Do it many times where you satisfy yourself that you've found a way that your arms and your whole self can work together in order to lighten the load of your head off the floor. And notice for yourself, what is your habit? Is your habit to lift your head as high as it can go? Is your habit to lift it so that a cigarette paper could slide under it? Or is the metaphor of a cigarette paper, that's, yes, obsolete, isn't it? I've got to let it go. A vape device. So you lift it up as high that you could slip a vaporizer underneath the back of your head. I've just got to get with it. Or somewhere in between. What is your habit? You have a modus operandi, won't you, for exploring the movement? So do what you do your default, and then try something different. And the difference is not doing something versus doing nothing. This is another of my metaphors I have to let go. I was discussing with Zoran last night, the sort of shades of grey stuff. Now this stupid woman took the title for this stupid set of books that I stupidly haven't, entered into my consciousness. Anyway, there are shades of grey. That's all I'm saying. How many positions of lifting are there? And therefore, which is the one that's the most informative? Or there are a series of most informative? Or does the informative nature of the movement change as you lift? And how close do your elbows come together to enable the lift to happen? So again, where did you go by default? Did they come sort of as close together as they could, or halfway, or did they stay wide? And again, don't take my word for that simple instruction. Experiment, like try a few different widths of the elbow. You keep your elbows really wide and lift. Who knows? Maybe that's the trick. The answer. No, it's just one of many answers. Leave it and rest a moment. So this is a simple, a very simple lesson. And you'll have done variations of this. Maybe you've done a lot more complicated variations of this maybe in your regular class back home. I really invite you to, you can't ignore your previous learning and your previous experience of these lessons. It's impossible. It's in your system, just like the sucking movement is in there somewhere. But how can you find a way to lift your head with this attitude of curiosity that like this is the first time? And not in the first time, this is the first time like Groundhog Day, oh God, that not that. It's this attitude, this state of mind where you can be fresh to something. And a lot of people actually had articulated that sort of quality, when they would, you could see it in their eyes when they were talking about their version of a great day. And it had this quality of freshness, this quality of wide-eyedness, this quality of openness. So I'm pretty confident that you know what I'm talking about. And is that state possible to elicit? And I tell you what, if you can elicit that state at will, that's fantastic. If you can help other people learn to elicit that state, you'll be a very successful and sought after person, as a friend or as a colleague or as anything. Okay, so come back to that. Bring your hands behind your head again. If you were having a rest, I think you were. Interlace your fingers the same way, your habitual way, the usual way, the one that you did without thinking. That's what habitual kind of means. And again, lift your head a few times and notice now, allow your attention to spread to how your relationship to the floor changes as you lift your head. So obviously, the gap behind the back of your head appears and increases. So your head moves away from the floor. What else moves away from the floor? Your elbows. And then what else moves away from the floor? What else? Maybe other things go further into the floor. Now, they can't go further into the floor because the floor is the floor. It's somewhat immutable. What seemingly increases the pressure? It's pressure. It's contact with the floor. And how far down your system can you feel the effect? The change of lifting your head. And go slowly and be precise. Because if you go fast, you won't feel it. Unless you know exactly where to look, where to pay your attention. Of course, then you can go fast. And with this aura of curiosity, like I'm interested in finding out what happens to maybe that funny little place in the small of my back as I'm lifting my head. What happens to my tailbone? What happens to my feet? What happens to my right foot and my left foot? Anything, nothing, something in between. And leave that. Allow your head to rest. Let your arms just rest for a moment. Rest your legs out long. Take a complete rest, actually. And in a way, with these lessons, this is the princess and the pea, isn't it? This princess who was so sensitive that she could tell if somebody put a pea under the mattress, a green pea, and I don't know, let's say she had 20 mattresses and she could still feel the pea. So what can you feel in terms of, the contact with your vertebrae can you distinguish your vertebrae as a couple of chunks, like the neck chunk and the chest chunk and the lower back chunk? Or is there starting to be a refinement about, well, some of my chest vertebrae are moving away from the floor and some are pushing more in, and you get more and more refined. So the distinction gets clearer. So maybe by the end of this 3 weeks, you'll be able to feel whether there's a pea or not under a single mattress. And then after 3 years, you'll be able to feel a pea with 5 mattresses. So that could be a competency, a test. That could be the test, the pea test. Or because it's Melbourne and you're all gourmet, it could be an edamame that we put under the mattress, because you wouldn't be so boring as to just have a pea. It have to be something groovy. So my family tell me I'm not allowed to say the word groovy because it's Not groovy. I can? Good. Okay. Bend your knees up in a very groovy way. Have your feet standing. Interlace your fingers the way that you don't have to think about. So the habitual way. And this time lift your head a few times and sneak your attention up so that you don't interfere with the behavior, kind of sort of look at it through the window, as it were, about whether do you hold your breath as you lift and breathe out as you lower, or do you do the opposite? That's one option. We could do it the other way. Do you breathe out as you lift your head and breathe in as you lower, or do you hold your breath the whole time? That's another option. Or your breathing is completely disinterested. So how would you go about answering that question? Well, let's be systematic. Everybody lift your head, and as you lift your head, breathe in, and as you lower your head, breathe out. And does that feel familiar? Or does that feel foreign? So you've answered part of the question. Do it a few times. And now lift your head as you breathe out and lower your head as you breathe in. Now here's where you kind of have to be honest, and I'll tell you, I'm the world's worst student. In my training, I just couldn't ever be bothered with this breathing nonsense, and I just fake it and not bother to do the exploration. If you want to do that, you're only cheating yourself. And now hold your breath the whole time. Don't breathe. And lift your head up and down. How's that? Does that feel familiar? And now here, of course, what are we going to conflate familiar with easiest? Because that's a very dastardly mixture. We do it all the time. What is familiar, we assume is easiest, but that's because we actually don't try anything else. So how would you distinguish between easier and familiar? And then the fourth option, and of course there's more than four options, but the four options I've posed you is that the breathing happens irregardless. Your breathing just goes in and out, and the timing of the in and out has nothing to do with the raising and the lowering. They're divorced. They're not interested in each other. There's no custody battles. Leave it and rest. Maybe roll onto one of your sides. That's a Feldenkrais joke that we say roll onto one of your sides, because of course, how could you roll onto both of them? You'd have to be really quick. The rotisserie lesson. I think it's Larry Goldfarb who says, roll up to sitting by way of one of your sides, because he's very precise. It's linguistically precise. And roll onto your back with your, roll flat onto your back and check in. See if you can detect any influence of the explorations on your status, your lying status, using the floor as your constant. the floor and gravity as the constant. And you might be systematic in your appraisal, the spaces behind your back, behind your knees, behind your ankles, your arms, behind the back of your shoulders, behind the back of your neck. This sensing of nothing, which is actually something. And please bring your knees up and stand your feet. Interlace your fingers the habitual way, so your usual way, and lift your head a few times and see how that is. Just enough to be satisfied that your head's still there and it's still connected and it's somewhat familiar. Now, the next time that you lift your head, arch your back. So you know that little place where you snuck your arm, your hand, feel, could you make that negative space bigger? How would you do that? How could you arch that as you lift your head? So if that's too much to do all at once, leave your head lying and just make the arch bigger a few times and then put the two together. And if it makes you frown, that's great, because frowning really helps learning. It's one of the best strategies. The first chapter on learning how to learn is deepen the frown. The second chapter is hold the breath. The third chapter is clench every sphincter. Go ahead, try them all. I encourage you to. Okay, so you're lifting your head and increasing the arch of your back as you lift. And if you feel quite spastic about it, that's great, because it is a very counterintuitive thing. And it's a Feldenkrais trick. If it's hard to do, you make it smaller. If it's hard to do, you do one and the other, and then you can interpose the two, or you arch your back and keep it arched and then raise your head. So how do we tackle a somewhat contrary, difficult movement? We break it down into smaller parts. We make them smaller, we make them slower. We start one and add the other. These are all strategies. And I work with people with disability a lot. And this is what we do all the time, because they can't tackle one big task like walking. So how do we break it down so the task still has the semblance of the thing that's meaningful and motivating for us, but in bite-sized chunks? And what I've come to realize is that this creating of bite-sized chunks in learning is quite a skill. People don't do it automatically. It's gobsmacking to me. We used to work with, rest now, I'm going to gossip. Lie down flat. Lay your legs down flat. This is terrible. Are there teachers in the room? Anybody a teacher? Well, we're all teachers, but yeah. I mean, teachers are very bright people. I mean, it would be on my resume that I'm a teacher, actually, as opposed to a witness of other people's learning, which is probably more accurate. Anyway, we were creating some workshops for primary school teachers to work with children who have sort of a very pervasive clumsiness, which probably, you know, at least 3 of you in the room had as a child and probably still do have this sort of developmental clumsiness, developmental coordination disorder it's called. You know, we're working with teachers in the workshops about how they can support these children with this idea of whatever task that they're having trouble with coordinating, whether it's a handwriting task or running or throwing or skipping or shoelaces or whatever. This idea of breaking it down into bite-sized chunks and how you tackle and get mastery over a couple of chunks. And now it's kind of, it sounds easy, but these teachers really struggled with it because they weren't movement trained teachers for starters. They're primary school teachers, and they really just wanted us to give them the steps. And we were really wanting to honour their smartness as teachers and get them to work it out for themselves. And it was quite a battle. It was a big lesson for me that to not make assumptions that people can break movements down and can be sort of systematic in the way that they might put together little chunks. So if that's hard for you, what I'm telling you is that very smart, very experienced, very accomplished teachers, primary school teachers, had trouble with it. So feel free to have trouble with it. That's the moral of the story. Okay, bend your knees up and have your feet standing. And now interlace your fingers the same habitual way and lift your head a few times. And allow your pelvis, so the small of your back, to do what it would like, which is probably not arching. And notice the influence of that on your lifting of the head. So when you do this with a very naive public, their head starts to feel lighter. And it's not because they're doing stomach crunches and getting stronger in the muscles, they're getting better organized. And that may be true for you. It's certainly true for me because this is not my, this is always something that I can refresh in myself. I mean, I think that's true for all of us. But so add in this little component that rather than what we did before, which was arch your back, you get the idea that the small of your back is actually pushing into the floor, so that the arch is reversing as you lift your head a tiny bit. Now, if that happens at the expense of breathing, Feldenkrais would come around and poke you with his foot and call you an idiot. So I could do that. It'd give me great pleasure, actually. Zoran could do it. No, he couldn't. He's too polite. He was brought up to be very polite. So nothing is worth holding your breath for. None of these movements are worth denying yourself the pleasure and the necessity of oxygen. So keep on breathing and find a way to lift your head with this idea that the vertebrae and the small of your back can become more acquainted with the floor. So in Amherst, Feldenkrais uses this metaphor of the arch in your back of being, you know, at first it's big enough for a rat to run under, and then the arch gets smaller and it's a mouse, and then it's, you know, a flea. And can I just say that that excites great disgust in some people, so we're not using that metaphor here. I come from the country, and mice running around on the floor is, you know, is a reality. And running under the small of your back is a hideous reality. Okay. Now, bring your hands out from behind your head and interlace them the non-habitual way. Now, for some people, you've done this many times. People who haven't done it before, you can look, if you're not sure. So the habitual way will be, let's say it's your left thumb on top, and then your right thumb's underneath it, and then the first finger on the left is on top of the first finger on the right, and so on. So if that's your habitual way, then the non-habitual way is the right thumb is on top. Just out of interest, whose habitual way is the right thumb on top? Put your hand up. Put your habitual hands up. The righties, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So half the room, right thumbs are on top, habitual, which means the other half of you, the left thumb is on top. Is that correct? Is there anybody who's bi in the thumb department? I don't mind about other ways of being bi. So now with the non-habitual interlacing, how do you know that, you know, like I want you to really just spend a moment or two sensing what it feels like to be non-habitual. Now, the sense of that is very apparent in the hand itself. how? Like, how do you know that that's not familiar? What does not familiar feel like? How does your brain detect not familiar? And again, it might conflate with not as easy, but it's actually not. Actually, biomechanically, it's just as easy. I mean, unless you've got a disability in one hand compared to the other, or a pain or a strain or something, there's not really a mechanical reason why one way would be mechanically easier than the other. But for you, it clearly does feel that, right? And this is what Zoran's talking about. This, we are inherently asymmetrical, and at some point in our lives, we made a decision to interlace our fingers with the right thumb on top or the left thumb on top. Why? Could be complete serendipity. Others, it could be, you know, a handedness thing, but you'd have to say that with 50% right on top, 50% left, it's handedness is not likely to be the parameter that predicts that choice. But just to know that these habits and these asymmetries are entrenched. Okay, so go ahead with the non-habitual interlacing of hands behind your head, and slowly, slowly lift your head. And again, you have to be the princess and the pea to detect that this will make a difference to the quality of the head lift. In that first instance, you have to go so slowly, because there will be a subtle difference from one shoulder girdle versus the other. Now, again, the question is, can you detect it or not? It's immaterial if you can or you can't at this point, just to know that that might be beyond your current sensory experience. And when I say that, does that give you a feeling of great lack, of great uselessness? Or do you just go, oh, that's really interesting, something I don't know, fabulous, or fascinating? And then go back to the habitual way of interlacing your fingers so that you've got that compare and contrast. Another feature of learning, the sensing, learning through sensing. And have you forgotten your breathing? Bring your arms out and lie them somewhere comfortably alongside. Leave your knees up. Observe yourself for a moment with your knees up. And a few times, just lift your head without using your hands. And notice that it is different. Lifting your head with and without your hands is different. Now, the movement of the head itself is the same. If we described it from a purely skeletal point of view, it's mostly the same, but the neurological, the sensory experience is different. I hope you'll agree. Where the work is happening is similar and different. And then go ahead, interlace your fingers and lift your head with the top of your hands again. And satisfy yourself of the similarities and the differences about where you feel the work. Now in Feldenkrais, we make distinctions about effort. I think this is going to be another rant, so maybe leave it and roll onto a comfortable position. Roll into your prepared for Susan's rant position. Again, because you have all experienced ATM, you know that we're obsessed with effort, and our obsession is in finding a way to decrease effort in a way that the movement starts to equate with less effort and more pleasure. Now, effort in itself isn't a bad thing. It's the question of whether you can manipulate the amount of effort is what we're interested in. Whether you can sense the difference in amounts of effort, and use the most efficient amount. That's the point. We will do some ATMs where you have to do work. I mean, lifting your head off the floor against gravity when it weighs about 4 kilos for most of us, work has to be done. It's not going to float up. This is not a helium lesson. It's a question of how we can pay attention to the feedback of where the effort, i.e. work, is, and how that can be distributed and organized in a way that is more efficient so that the sensory experience is one of ease and effortlessness. The effortlessness is a conceit. Effort still needs to occur. It becomes less effort, more distributed, greater sense of ease. We'll go through this many, many times. It's about operationalizing how we improve our movement, what we're looking for, the feedback that we're looking for, this illusion of effortlessness. That makes your head spin. That's great. Head spinning is tomorrow's lesson, so you're getting a head, getting a little precursor. Roll onto your back. Have your knees bent up. Actually, leave your knees down for a moment. Just check in again. So the check-in is around the monitoring, the surveillance, if you like, of those negative spaces. The space behind the small of your back, the space behind your knees, the space behind the back of your neck. The sense of self around the sense of no self. And now bend your knees up, have your feet standing. And now interlace your fingers again, and we'll add another dimension, which is so your eyes can still be closed, but have the intention that you want to look between your legs, so that as you lift your head, there is now another intention. It's not just an abstract lifting of the head, but it has this purpose of I want to see between my legs. Feldenkrais's quaint term is to look at your sex, which is what he called genitals. So the verb becomes the noun in his language. If he wanted to see, as I'll quote Larry again, he'll be so delighted I've quoted him twice on one day. Your intention is to look down there. And does that make a difference? Adding in the eyes as the motivator, if you like, or not. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. It's just for you to see if that's something that adds to your experience. Now remove your hands and put them somewhere around your lower ribs, so on the front of you, around your lower ribs. And as you lift your head up, find a way that would push your lower ribs back into the floor as you lift your head. And you can do it and not do it to satisfy yourself, to see if that makes a difference or not. And then find another place to push that might be better or worse. Worse is not a useful word, but make it more or less easy. Maybe you could push on your sternum, so that's the chest bone. Whereabouts on the sternum? Would it be in the middle of the sternum, or would it be towards the tail of the sternum, so the bottom end of the sternum? Where else could you find 4 different places that you could press kind of into the floor, as it were, to see if that makes a difference to the lifting of the head. And leave it, just rest for a moment. Oh, actually lift your head. Just do a little test movement of lifting your head with your hands. Be curious to see, did that pushing, giving yourself a little mini FI, did that make a difference? Did that inform you in some way? Did it remind you of some other ingredient that might help distribute the work of lifting the head? Good, and now leave it. Rest with your legs long for a moment. And if there's a part of you that is feeling tired, that's feedback. That's saying you're overworking me, this part of me. And that's of interest, so that you can resolve when you come back to the position and we lift your head again, that you'll be more attentive and more aware of that part and not make so many demands of it. What could you do? You could do a smaller movement. You could find another place to activate so that the workload is shared. Or you could rest because satiety might have been reached and you might, that's it, you don't want to do any more. So sometimes in an ATM, you know, there might be a polite form of anarchy where you say, enough's enough, I'm going to just quietly lie out for this. And you know that that's okay. So long as you make the decision with awareness and it's not just copping out. Like my mother could tell the difference when I say, you know, I wouldn't eat my carrots. That's not satiety, that's I don't like carrots. And it's avoidance behavior. There's a difference. Okay, bend your knees up. And this time, just have your left hand behind the back of your head and quietly lift your head up a few times with just your left arm, just your left hand. How does that change? And now with the intention that your left elbow is going to go between your legs. Of course, it won't get there. It has the intention of going in that direction, just like your eyes didn't physically go between your legs. They had the intention of that direction. What happens when your elbow has that intention? How does that change the shape of you on the floor? What's pushing into the floor and what's moving away from the floor? And then leave your left arm quietly and just lift your head a few times by itself. And how's the lift going with your head? And then repeat that with your right arm. What are the similarities and what are the differences? Slowly, gently, sustainably. So what I could have said at the beginning of the lesson is you're going to be lifting your head for the best part of 55, 60 minutes. How are you going to do it in a way that's sustainable? Responsible head lifting. With the ultimate environmentalists in here, we learn sustainability from direct experience. And when you're satisfied with the exploration of how it feels different or similar or both, lifting with the right hand versus the left hand, rest with your feet still standing just for a moment. Lift your head by itself a few times, just without the hands. And then with the hands. And this time as your head lifts, could your knees come towards your head a little bit so your feet lift off? And how do you do that? What do you compromise? Can you still do that easily? Is there a grunt? Is there a push? Is there a moment of, is there a spike in effort? So what we're after is that the effort, you know, if we graft the effort, there's just this gradual increase and a gradual decrease, not a sudden spike or spurt. Because that's where injuries happen. And you can leave your knees up so they're kind of hanging over your chest with your feet off the floor. And just lower and lift your head a few times with your knees staying where they are. Slowly, slowly. And can you do this in a way that the princess and the pea can really track those vertebrae? What's happening behind you? What's the floor telling you about your vertebrae and the small of your back in particular? The space behind the back of your neck. And when they're both up towards each other and your knees and your elbows are somewhat oriented towards each other, slowly, slowly take them away from each other. So your head comes back to the floor and your feet come back to the floor. And what happened to your breathing? So that next time when you do this movement, could your breathing be divorced? Could you get that same quality where your breathing is disinterested? It's vital. It happens all the time. It's not involved. It's not influenced. So the muscles of breathing are not being yoked into effort. They're still free to breathe. This is so important. Beautiful. Rest. Have a full rest. And hopefully you're checking into yourself and making sure that you are taking care of yourself, that you are exercising kindness to all of your bits, that if there is a strain somewhere, that you resolve and promise faithfully to take better care of that place. If it's, you know, the back of your neck is feeling too lengthened and tweaked, you're pulling on it. Right? So you pull on, you don't pull on it. You lift less. If you're feeling, you know, jittery in your tummy muscles, ease off on them. This is not gym. This is not anti-gravity fitness, whatever that is. Okay, please come back onto your back and bend your knees. You have your feet standing. And bring your knees up over your chest. Your hands are behind your head. And just imagine that your right elbow and your right knee are coming closer together. Imagine it. Simply imagine it. What do you imagine? How do you know that you're doing it? Where would your attention go to confirm? So they're not going to touch each other, so it's not going to be a tactile change. But how many elements could you imagine that would tell you in reality that your right elbow and your right knee are coming together? How many parts of you can you picture, either seeing yourself or feeling yourself doing this movement? And go ahead and do it. Take your right elbow and your right knee in the direction of each other. If you touch, there'll be consequences, seriously bad consequences. And is it as you imagined? Is it more? Are there things that you can sense about this movement that you hadn't imagined? Could you be delighted in that? Then go ahead on the left side, so the left elbow and the left knee. Is it the same? Do it in reality. And then let your left foot come away and go back to the floor, and your right foot stays up in the air, or your knee stays over the chest. So the left foot is standing on the floor, the knee's bent, and the right knee is still close. And now again, take your right elbow in the direction of the right knee, and the right knee in the direction of the right elbow. Both hands are behind your head. Yeah, interlaced, habitual way. And is it a possibility that as your right knee and your right elbow come towards each other, that you sense the asymmetry in you, and that there may be the possibility of a slight turn. You may turn one way or the other. And you're not going as far as you can. Where do your eyes go? So it's just the right elbow going towards the right knee. Not both elbows going towards the right knee, just the right elbow. That's it. Good, leave that. Right foot down and have your left foot up. No rest for the wicked. And now the left elbow comes towards the left knee. Where do your eyes go? Could you find a way that as your left knee and your left elbow come towards each other, that you go more onto your right side? and back to the middle. And find a way that as your left knee and your left elbow come together, you go onto more onto your left side. Which way feels easier? If you're going to roll, because you are a bunch of babies, and babies are into ease and comfort, which way is easier to roll as your left elbow and left knee come together? Onto your right side or onto your left side? And how do you introduce that? How does the asymmetry turn into a roll? A roll or a plop? There's a difference between rolling and plopping, but that's okay. Leave it rest on your back. Bend your knees up, your feet standing. And interlace your fingers whichever way you like. And lift your head a few times. Slowly, slowly, and tracking how it was. So how's your memory of how it was at the beginning? How's your memory of how it was halfway through the lesson? And comparing it to now. And then broaden your attention to the memory of the influence of lifting your head on all of you. On your feet, the small of your back, the back of your buttocks, your ribs, the ribs at the front, the ribs at the back, the chest bone, the backs of your shoulders, shoulder girdles, shoulder blades. And then next time you lift your head up, bring your knees and your elbows together a few times so that your feet always stay off the floor. The knees come more or less close. And find a way the next time that your left elbow and your left knee come more towards each other, and that introducing that asymmetry that could help you roll to the right. I'll give you a little heads up. And you can plop if you, plopping is fine. And then how would you find a way to go back? This is the beginning of a whole series of rolling lessons. So feel free to plop. We're just going to plop today. And then if you wanted to roll onto your left side, could you bring your right elbow and right knee together? What would happen to the left knee and the left elbow is an interesting question that might help you not plop. So my only constraint has been, my only instruction, it's not really a constraint, is that when you're rolling to the right, your left elbow and left knee go together. But if they touch, it won't happen. They don't touch, because otherwise they'll lock in. And then there's something about the other knee, the right knee, that could control the plop. Holding your breath is a sad waste of effort. Babies don't. They can do all this and cry at the same time. Or laugh. So maybe it's the leg that you're rolling towards, the elbow and the knee can maybe come a little bit away from each other to help control the descent. Or not. Now increase the timing. So you're changing orientation a lot. So could you go fast? Whee! And breathing. Beautiful. And then find a way to onto your back and lengthen your legs and rest. So that's the Feldy version of a back massage. And so this is the last scan, this opportunity to check in. How are you lying on the floor now? How's the floor feel to you? What's it telling you? What bits are more or less informative in terms of what's touching the floor and what's not touching the floor? So if you sense the dimensions of that negative space behind your knees, behind your ankles, behind the small of your back, behind the back of your neck, wherever else you detected it, back of your shoulders, wrists, wherever it was for you, and it's different for everybody. How is it now? So only you can be the judge of this experiment. I can only see so much. And if you're curious and you remember what it was like to lift your head before, you go ahead, bend your knees and lift your head a few times, with and without your hands. As small as you need to be satisfied that something has changed. And if something's changed, you can infer that learning has taken place. So we can't measure learning. We can only measure, we can only infer that learning has happened because change has happened. And what you're going to get very good at in here is detecting change. Becoming more confident that you've learned because you can detect change. And if through the learning, maybe your head's lost a few kilos, that's great. Good. Rest on your back for a moment. And then roll over and come up to sitting. And there's a reason why we get up slowly. So this is a pretty relentless lesson. And it can change your blood pressure and it can change all sorts of other things. So you get up slowly for your physiology, for one thing, but also to track the changes so that you don't, when you've had a lesson, you say to the practitioner, oh, I feel different. How do I keep this difference? Well, one of the ways to keep it is to go slowly so that you can maintain the awareness of any changes that may have happened. If you get up quickly, you're highly likely to get up habitually and go straight back into a default pattern. So there's many, many reasons why you give yourself time to get up slowly. Yep, and then come up to standing. And again, give yourself time to reacquaint yourself in standing so that you don't immediately adopt your habitual standing posture, but there is the opportunity for any learning that's happened on the floor to accompany you into standing. Speed is not our friend from a learning point of view. Speed learning is that what the oxymoron when it's a contradictory thing? Two words are contradictory. Good, thank you. I always forget those. Tautologies and oxymorons, I always get them mixed up. Same thing. Gotcha. Excellent. Now I know who to look for when I have my linguistic challenges. Julie. Thank you, Julie. Okay. How are we collectively? What happens when we're inexorably working our flexors? That's what we were doing. Go for a walk. And your sense, now walking is so difficult to sense changes because it is so habitual and it's so hard, you know, it's not hardwired for us to go straight, but it's damn close. So what do you detect? Anything, nothing, something? This influence. And as you know, some lessons don't touch you at all. Other lessons completely discombobulate you. Others are kind of subtle. How is this for you? Knowing that all of those possibilities are perfectly fine. And I think that's the end of the day. And I reckon Jenny's got something to say. Yes, I do. Thank you for reminding me. So before you disappear for the day, there will be 3 FIs tomorrow at lunch. So Jenny and Zoran and I will be giving individual functional integration lessons if people haven't got in the swim about what FI is. And your name for that will be, who's the board? Who knows?